We've covered a lot of computers here on Vintage Geek, but none like the one we're going to look at today. This is the Gerber Scientific 6200, and this is Vintage Geek. Just a reminder, if you like what you see today, please consider liking and subscribing. It helps us a lot as we grow, and one of the things that helps us out the most is if you would consider becoming a Vintage Geek member. You can do that at the website, and for just under $20 a year, you get access to all of our content commercial-free, plus some bonus extras and more. It's all at vintagegeek.com. Ever since we opened the Vintage Geek Museum, we've heard from a lot of people out there with various forms of technology that they've considered donating to a museum or something like that. And every once in a while, you get one of those calls that's just like no other, and that is the case when we got the call about this Gerber Scientific computer. The gentleman that called us explained that this particular machine came from an estate sale back in the early 2000s. This particular computer was living in someone's home, someone that worked for the Department of Defense at the Pentagon, and this particular computer was assigned to him personally. It may have been the first personally assigned computer at the Pentagon altogether. It was made by a company called the Gerber Scientific Instrument Company, and that's really about as much as I know about this at this point. I don't know what this computer did. I don't know what its original purpose was or any of the components that go into it. So this is the first time we're looking at it. We were able to get the Gerber Scientific machine into our space here at the Vintage Geek Museum, and right now we have it in front of our technology timeline. The technology timeline is just a convenient way for our guests to be able to see the progress of computers throughout history, and it's a handy little guide to learning about the history of things here at the museum. And it just seems to fit here, so it may end up living here permanently. I don't know for sure yet. We're going to take a look at this together, kind of dissect it piece by piece, and see if we can figure out what this Gerber Scientific Instrument computer was for. Let's check it out here on Vintage Geek. I want to start by taking a look at the bottom section of the Gerber computer here, and that's because it seems like all the power supply section is at the bottom of the cabinet, which makes sense because it's probably the heaviest components. I will say that in attempting to move this, it is on wheels, so you can roll it around fairly easily, but getting it into a truck and actually loading it up was extremely difficult. This thing is very, very heavy. Now, looking at the bottom section, we start at the very bottom with the Gerber power supply. This is actually a separate rack-mounted chassis, and it's got 2 meters on the front for voltage and current. The voltage meter on this goes up to 100 volts, and the current meter goes up to 25 amps. So we're talking about a pretty monstrous power supply on this thing. I don't know what voltage it actually uses, because anything in that range could be applicable, I suppose, but that's a heck of a lot of current. This unit does require 240 volts AC, so the chances of us being able to power this on in the museum environment are pretty limited. We would have to get a different circuit run over here to be able to even try powering this up. So for any of you watching this video expecting a power on test, that is not going to be happening today. This is very much an exploratory video, but I'm still excited to get into it and see everything this machine has to offer. Moving up from the power supply, which according to the label is the MPS-8B, we've got another rack-mounted chassis. This one's got an open frame design, so you can kind of see everything inside it. To the right, there is a barrier strip with a number of different terminals, and it does appear that there's a cable just kind of sitting in the chassis that's not connected to anything. I'm not sure what's going on with that. The card cage itself appears to have 5 different cards plugged into it, and these are all Gerber branded cards. Above this card cage assembly is another chassis that looks like it's just for large cooling fans, so this thing must put out some pretty decent heat when everything is up and running. I'd like to take a quick look at the cards that are in the system. Maybe these cards will be a clue to what this computer actually does. The first card is labeled GRP2. There's an area on the card as well that shows a serial number badge, but there's no serial number on it. Now this kind of goes along with the story that we were told that this particular computer was built custom and was not actually part of a normal product line. To me, this looks like it may be something to do with power supply regulation, but I'm really not sure. Next up, we have a card that's labeled the GLP1. So these all seem to start with the letter G, which I assume means Gerber. The serial number badge, again, is there, but blank. Moving on to card 3, we have another GLP1 card. This does appear to be identical to the first one, minus a piece of masking tape at the top left-hand corner. Again, no serial number on the card. That seems like it's going to be the case with all of them. Next up, looking at card 4, we have a GLP25. This is the same prefix as the other cards, but with the 25 numbering on it. Again, don't know what it does, but it does have a capacitor that looks like it's seen better days, kind of at the top right-hand side of the board. And again, like all of the other cards, no serial number. And finally, in the 5th card slot, we have a GLP2. So again, same prefix, just a different numbering on the card. And again, like the other cards, no serial number. Really curious if any of you out there had any experience with any of the cards we've shown here in our Gerber Scientific computer, and I'm very much looking forward to seeing your comments. Now moving on to the top of the unit, we've got this really cool 1/2-inch tape drive. According to the label, this was made by a company called Kennedy, and I did look this up, and Kennedy ended up eventually making other types of drives, hard disk drives, and got into some other peripherals. It was just good to find some basic information on something in this chassis. Now looking at this particular tape drive, the label also says that it's a 9-track tape. Apparently this 1/2-inch wide tape had 9 tracks of data on it. Don't know what kind of format that data would have been in or what kind of data it contains, but we also have a couple of boxes coming from the owner of this that had some of the tapes and possibly some documentation. So we're really hoping that we'll have some additional helpful tools there that we can look at. Now this tape drive is really interesting in the fact that it has kind of a control panel at the top left with a number of different buttons on it. And that control panel has a really cool sliding cover. This particular control panel has a number of LED indicators and buttons. Now starting with the buttons at the top, we've got test mode, right test, stop, forward run, reverse run, fast forward, and fast reverse. So I assume those are mostly for the tape transport controls themselves, other than the right test, which I guess you could write some data to the actual tape. There are LEDs that accompany the top 2 buttons, so I assume those indicate when it's in that mode. Then there's some other separate LEDs in the panel. One of them says load point, and we've got EOT, I assume that means end of tape, data, and SKU, and then there's a little tiny button below those that says test. Not sure how any of that worked, but it's a really interesting little panel, and I love the little cover that slides over to cover up all those controls. Moving down on the left-hand side of this tape drive, we have some larger controls. These are the bigger push buttons that are always exposed. The first one is the online button, which has its own LED indication. There's also a load button and a rewind button. All of these have LEDs that correspond with those functions. Above that, we have a set of LED indicators for write, select, read, and write enable. A lot of different things happening with this tape drive, a lot of controls and indications that I really know nothing about, but they look cool. I definitely want to talk a little bit about the door of this thing. I love the way that this is designed. It feels good when you open the door to actually access the tape and where you would load the tapes into the system. Conveniently, there is a single screw on the front of this Kennedy tape drive that will allow access to everything inside by basically hinging out the entire front panel, which is really handy because there is a ton to this particular tape drive. This thing is an absolute beast, so you could service the machine, maybe work on the motors or the capstan or something like that. Pretty unique engineering that went into this box. There are 2 card cages in this. One has 7 cards, one has 5. There's additional control cards on the actual back of the transport assembly. There are industrial grade motors, a capstan motor, and a lot more that I'm not going to get into the weeds on today, but there is a legend that tells you what all of the cards do and some other instructions inside as well. So I'm not going to actually take out the individual cards, but it's worth noting that there is a ton going on in this tape drive. It also looks like some bad things may have happened toward the bottom left side of the chassis. Not sure what that is yet, but again, we're just exploring today. This is our first look inside the Kennedy tape drive, and it is very cool. And now we're getting to what I assume is the heart of the system, what appears to be the control panel at the middle of this rack assembly. And this is the only thing that actually tells us what the model of the system is. It does show that it's the Gerber Scientific Instrument Company Model 6200. I did try to find this online, and I was unable to find any actual documentation. Apparently there is a collection of the Gerber Scientific Instrument Company at the Smithsonian, but it's in some storage facility that we'll have to request access to. So maybe in the future we'll be able to look at some of those documents, but right now this is all the documentation we have. Now looking at this control panel, there are a number of different things happening here, and this may give us the best clues as to what this machine was for. So I want to just kind of take a look at this one step at a time. Starting on the left hand side, we have a tape search area, and it's got 2 thumb wheel type controls that have digits on them. I assume this would allow you to jump to a particular position on the tape. That would seem to make logical sense, but I'm not exactly sure how that would work, if you would hold the push button down while the tape was spinning, or if you just hit it once and it would automatically know. Interesting control nonetheless. Below that, we have one of my favorite controls on this entire system, the emergency stop button. I'm not sure what situation would actually require an emergency stop on this unit, but it does raise a lot of curiosity for me. We'll just have to wait on that one, I suppose. Next to that is the power button, which is a push button, and it is momentary, or at least it doesn't seem to latch, so I guess it must trigger some kind of contactor or relay assembly to actually engage power to the system. We'll know more about that when we get into the inner workings of the power supply in the rear of the cabinet, possibly in a future video. Now, moving further to the right across this control panel, we have a number of buttons all in a row. Some of these aren't actually buttons. Some of them appear to be just indicators, but they're in the same exact shape and form factor as the rest. I'm going to just go through these buttons very quickly, as I don't know exactly what they all mean. We've got the start button, the halt button, and an origin button. I assume those are tape control type buttons, not 100% sure. Then we have the init button, must be for initialize. We have an error reset button. It seems to be self-explanatory. Then we've got a clear button. There's a system fault indicator. That's one of the ones that's just the light, not a button itself. Then we've got an off-scale indicator. That's just a light. And then to the right of that, we have two more red push buttons that have no label whatsoever. So I'm not sure if that means that they just had a prefabricated assembly of these buttons and they just didn't use them, or if they were for some future function of the system. Don't know. Below that, we have 4 control knobs. Now, this is probably the best hint I've seen so far of what this machine did. The first one is labeled pen, and it has up, down, and auto as the selectable options. The fact that this says pen on it definitely leads me to believe that this had something to do with imaging or design, maybe a plotter. Maybe it was used to capture data. From the limited information I found online, it seems like Gerber Scientific was very interested in converting images into some kind of digital data. So maybe that had something to do with it. Or maybe it was the reverse, taking digital data and using some kind of unique printer to actually print it out. I'm really not sure, but the pen is interesting to me. Then we've got the next knob, which is size, and that has 1, 2, 3, or 4. I don't know what those sizes are in relation to. Again, maybe this is something to do with paper or something with images, not sure. Then we've got the speed control, which is 1/4, 1/2, 3/4, or full. That must have to do with the tape speed. So I guess that you could potentially store more data if you were using a slower tape speed, or maybe it was the speed that it was capturing data or plotting things. Really don't know. Then lastly, we have the most curious control, which is mirror image. And the options on this are off, X, Y, or X, Y. Again, this kind of lends itself towards that plotter theory. Maybe this had something to do with digital imaging, that you could do a mirror image of something with this computer. I don't know, but I am absolutely fascinated to find out. Next up, I want to take a quick look inside this panel, as it does look like it's hinged on the bottom. We should be able to see the contents. Now that we have this open, it's a little bit more evident that this may have been some kind of an early prototype unit. There are actually masking tape labels above the button row that have handwritten labels of what those buttons were for, which is actually pretty cool in this case, because the 2 right-hand buttons that I was not sure of, one of which is actually just an indicator, are actually labeled as ACC, which I assume means accessory, and the last one is actually labeled spare. So that answers that question at least. There is a masking tape label that also shows a work order number, as well as what could be a model number. Not 100% sure on that. Again, these are handwritten labels. Now, the panel itself has all of the buttons, the controls. There's cable assemblies that go back behind that to a large wire array that may be the back of a card cage. I'm not sure until we actually get into the back side of this unit, but you can't tell a lot from what's going on there other than the very intricate work in wire wrap that was done inside this unit, which is really cool to see actually. Looking below that though, there are a few labels on the chassis that are indicative of what this machine was, and this kind of goes back into that theory about this being some kind of imaging device, either to capture images or to produce them. There is one that gives it away to some degree. There's a connector that says plotter slew, which I assume is a setting for the plotter itself that this would have been connected to, perhaps. There are also some connectors inside here for the motor driver, as well as the accessory head. So I'm starting to think maybe this was for an external device, maybe some kind of a plotter device. Maybe these motors were all part of that. Maybe I was misreading those controls as being tape transport controls, and when in reality they're controlling some kind of a head on a device that captures images. I'm not really sure, but this device just keeps getting more interesting to me as I kind of pull back the layers and look a little bit deeper. I'm really looking forward to getting into the rest of this, but because we have a limited amount of time, we're going to have to do that in the next video. I want to take a look at the back side of the unit, how the power supplies are configured and how all of that is arranged, and what other components we might find, perhaps the cards that are on the back of this control unit. Really looking forward to it and potentially getting a little bit more material in the future as well. Again, want to strongly encourage you, if you know anything about the Gerber Scientific Instrument Company, this machine, or anything that we've looked at today, please sound off in the comments below. Your help will be instrumental in potentially getting this machine to some kind of functioning life in the future, if it's even possible, and we really appreciate your time looking at it with us today. Just a quick reminder, if you like vintage technology, be sure to like and subscribe. And one of the things that helps us out the most here is if you would consider becoming a Vintage Geek member. You can do that at the website, and for just under $20 a year, you get access to all of our content commercial-free, plus some bonus extras and more. It's all at vintagegeek.com. Until next time, I'm Aaron, and this has been Vintage Geek.